It's over. I'm deleting everything. I'm afraid of losing you when the contract ends.
The rain didn't just fall in Manhattan tonight. It mourned. It lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Obsidian with a rhythmic, violent persistence that mirrored the drumming of Elowen Vance's heart. She checked her vintage Cartier watch, a gift from the grandfather whose cold, dead hand was currently tightening a noose around her future. 11:42 p.m. In 18 minutes, she would cross the threshold into her 30th year. If she crossed it alone, the Vance empire, a $50 million legacy of real estate and history, would vanish, diverted into a trust she couldn't touch. "I am selling my soul to save my skin," she whispered, her voice lost in the low hum of jazz and clinking crystal. Her fingers, ice cold and trembling, smoothed the leather portfolio in her lap. The contract inside was a masterpiece of clinical detachment. A 6-month marriage, a silent partner, a clean break. She scanned the amber-lit gloom of the bar. Table 4. That was the designated spot. Her grandfather's lawyer had promised a man of discretion and professional ambition. A mercenary in a red tie who understood that this was a transaction, not a romance. Then, she saw him. He was sitting in the corner booth, a silhouette of raw power and sharp angles. He wasn't wearing a red tie. It was a silk knit in deepest navy. But Elowen was too blinded by the ticking clock to care about a shade of fabric. He was looking down at a stack of documents, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested a man who didn't like to lose. His presence was magnetic, a heavy, grounding force in a room full of shadows. Elowen slid into the booth across from him. The scent of him hit her instantly. Sandalwood, rain, and something fundamentally masculine that made her lungs hitch. He looked up, and for a moment, the world stopped. His eyes were the color of a Texas thunderstorm, gray and turbulent, possessing an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "You're late," he said. His voice was a low, honeyed drawl, vibrating with a resonance that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. It wasn't the voice of a hired clerk. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "The weather is fitting for a funeral," Elowen replied, her voice cracking. She pushed the contract across the mahogany table. "I assume you've been briefed on the terms? No physical intimacy, no personal prying. You play the husband for 6 months. You receive your fee, and you disappear. My life remains mine. Your life becomes significantly wealthier." Caleb Sterling stared at her. He was in New York to fight a corporate takeover, expecting a shark from a rival firm. Instead, he was looking at a woman who looked like a shattered diamond. Brilliant, sharp, and desperately broken. He saw the shimmer of unshed tears in her emerald eyes and felt a sudden, irrational ache in his chest. He didn't know what this feat was, but he knew corporate games. He assumed this was a high-stakes settlement disguised in theatrics. "I've had enough of the games tonight," Caleb said, his pride stinging from a week of New York snobbery. He wanted to sign whatever peace treaty this was and go back to his hotel. "Let's just get this over with." He unscrewed his fountain pen. The clock on the wall moved with agonizing slowness. 11:59 p.m. Elowen leaned forward, her face pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Sign it," she urged, her voice a fragile thread. "Please, before it's too late." Caleb looked at her one last time. There was a haunting longing in her gaze, a silent plea for rescue that he couldn't ignore. He scrawled his name, Caleb Sterling, in bold, aggressive strokes across the bottom line. The clock struck midnight. The chimes felt like a death knell and a birth cry all at once. "It's done," she exhaled, her eyes closing as she slumped against the leather. "Elowen?" A voice called from the bar. A thin man in a bright red tie approached. looking flustered. I'm Julian. The subway was blocked. I'm here for the arrangement. The blood drained from Elowen's face. She looked at the man in the red tie, then at the rugged stranger sitting across from her. She looked at the signature on the legal marriage license, a document that was now legally binding in the state of New York. If you're Julian, she whispered, her heart stopping, then who did I just marry? Quote, Caleb's gray eyes widened as he finally read the header of the document. Ma'am, he said, his voice dropping an octave in shock. I think we just made a very permanent mistake. The morning sun didn't just rise. It interrogated. It sliced through the sheer silk curtains of Elowen's Fifth Avenue penthouse with a clinical brightness that made the events of the previous night feel like a fever dream. Elowen sat at her marble kitchen island, her head buried in her hands, her fingers tangled in the dark silk of her hair. Across from her, Caleb Sterling paced the length of the living room. He moved with the restless energy of a predator caught in a gilded cage, his rugged Texas frame looking entirely out of place amidst her minimalist high society decor. A marriage license. Elowen, not a merger, not a settlement, Caleb said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his stormy gray eyes searching hers for a way out that didn't exist in my world. A man's word is his bond, and his signature is his life. I just signed my life over to a woman whose last name I didn't even know 12 hours ago. You don't understand the stakes, Elowen whispered, finally looking up. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the emerald depth of them clouded by a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. My grandfather didn't just leave me a company. He left me a prison. If I don't stay married for 6 months, I lose the Vance legacy. The board, men who have waited decades for me to trip, will strip every asset. They'll take my home, my work, and the only proof I have that I was ever enough for my family. She stood up, her movements stiff. She walked toward him, stopping just outside the circle of his heat. I am asking you to stay. 6 months of a lie to secure a lifetime of freedom. I will pay you $2 million. I will fund your company's expansion. I will give you everything you were coming to New York to fight for. Caleb, just don't walk out that door. Caleb looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a cold heiress. He saw a woman standing on the edge of a precipice, her heart laid bare in a way that made his own chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. He had spent his life building things from the dirt up, and he recognized the look of someone fighting to keep their foundations from crumbling. $2 million won't buy my soul, Elowen, he said softly, stepping closer until the scent of her, faint jasmine and expensive soap, clouded his senses. But I won't be the reason you lose everything. I'll play your husband, but if we're doing this, we do it right. No more secrets between us. If I'm going to lie to the world, I need to know the truth of the woman I'm lying for. The story was put to the test that evening at the Vance Foundation Gala. It was a sea of black ties and predatory smiles. Elowen had dressed Caleb in a charcoal suit that hugged his broad shoulders with lethal precision. As they stepped onto the red carpet, the flashbulbs felt like a firing squad. Elowen's hand trembled as she tucked it into the crook of his arm. Sensing her panic, Caleb didn't just hold her. He pulled her flush against his side, his large hand covering hers, grounding her. Breathe, Elo, he murmured against her ear, his warm breath sending a jolt of electricity down her spine that had nothing to do with the script. Lean into me. Let them think I'm the only thing keeping you upright because I'm so damn obsessed with you. They met her parents near the champagne fountain. Alistair and Beatrice Vance were statues of icy perfection. A Texan, Elowen? Beatrice sneered, her gaze raking over Caleb with a condescending narrowness. Hardly the strategic alliance we discussed. Caleb didn't flinch. He tightened his grip on Elowen's waist, drawing her closer. Strategic? No, ma'am, he said, his Texas drawl turning into a weapon of charm. It was more like a lightning strike. I saw your daughter and realized my life was empty without her fire. I didn't want a merger. I wanted her. He leaned down and pressed a slow, lingering kiss to Elowen's temple. It was meant to be a performance, a calculated move to silence the skeptics. But as his lips touched her skin, the room blurred into a smear of light and noise. For Elowen, the world narrowed down to the steady, heavy thud of Caleb's heart against her shoulder. For a heartbeat, the lie felt more real than the truth. Later, in the silent sanctuary of the limousine, the air between them was thick, charged with the ghost of that kiss. "You're a very convincing actor," Elowen said, her voice small, her eyes fixed on the city lights streaking past the window. Caleb leaned back into the shadows of the leather seat, his eyes never leaving her silhouette. "I told you, Elowen, I don't play games. The fire I mentioned? That wasn't in the script. The piece didn't just break. It shattered." 3 weeks into their arrangement, the New York Chronicle hit the stands with a front-page splash that sent Elowen's world into a tailspin. A grainy, high-contrast photo from that fateful night at the Obsidian showed Caleb's hand over hers as he signed the marriage license. The headline screamed, "Vance heiress. The midnight merger or a $50 million fraud?" Asterisk. "They're circling." "Caleb," Elowen said, her voice trembling as she paced her office. The newspaper crumpled in her fist. "The executors, the board, the press, they smell blood. They think this was a business transaction to bypass the will. If they prove we weren't a love match from the start, they'll void the inheritance and tie me up in litigation for a decade." Caleb stood by the window, his large frame silhouetted against the Chrysler building. He looked at the photo, the way he was looking at her even then, before he knew her name. There was an intensity in his gaze that the camera had captured, a raw curiosity that had already begun to shift into something more dangerous. "We have to go bigger," he said, turning to face her. "We don't just tell them we're married. We show them. A public vow renewal, a wedding that looks like a fairy tale New York couldn't dream up. We make it so loud and so romantic that anyone who questions us looks like a cynic." "A wedding?" Elowen's breath hitched. "Caleb, we're already living in a house of cards. Now you want to build a cathedral on top of it? The flowers, the vows, the intimacy. I can't keep pretending when my heart feels like it's being crushed every time you look at me." She stopped, her eyes widening at her own admission, the longing she had tried to bury, the way she reached for his side of the bed in the middle of the night, the way her skin hummed whenever his hand brushed hers, was spilling out. Caleb crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches from her. The air between them thickened, heavy with the scent of his cologne and the electric charge of things unsaid. "Is that what this is, Elowen? Pretending?" Quote. He reached out, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. His touch was feather-light but felt like a brand. Elowen leaned into it, a soft, broken sound escaping her throat. She wanted to disappear into him, to forget the contracts and the millions and the cold, gray walls of her grandfather's legacy. "I don't know what's real anymore," she whispered, her eyes searching his stormy gray ones. The arrival of Caleb's sister, Madison, only added fuel to the fire, a whirlwind of Texas energy. Madison took one look at the tension in the penthouse and laughed. "Caleb Sterling, you always were a terrible liar. You're looking at this girl like she's the only water in a desert. And you're trying to tell me this is a business arrangement." Quote. Madison became their reluctant co-conspirator, but she was also a mirror. She forced them into dance lessons for the first dance, where Caleb's hand stayed firmly on the small of Elowen's back, guiding her through the waltz. Every spin brought her closer to his chest, her head resting against his heartbeat. It was a rhythmic, steady thrum that felt like home, a place Elowen had never truly known. One night, exhausted from planning, they ended up on the sofa, a bottle of wine between them. The city lights twinkled like fallen stars outside. "Why didn't you leave?" Eowyn asked softly, her head lolling back against the cushions. "That first morning, you could have called a lawyer. You could have walked away from the mess." Caleb looked at her, his expression softening into something so tender it made her ache. "Because for the first time in my life, I found something worth staying for. And it wasn't the 2 million. Ello, it was the way you looked at me when you thought I was your hero. I wanted to be that man for real." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The silence was a living thing, vibrating with a longing so intense it was physical. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a performance. It was a desperate, hungry claim, a vow made in the dark that no contract could ever contain. The week of the grand vow renewal arrived like a hurricane wrapped in white silk and expensive lilies. Eowyn's penthouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a war room filled with seamstresses, florists, and the suffocating scent of thousands of roses. But beneath the fragrance of celebration, a darker smell lingered, the scent of a trap being set. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private estate in the Hamptons, a glass-walled fortress overlooking a churning Atlantic. Eowyn stood on the balcony, her breath hitching as the cold salt air whipped her hair. She felt a presence behind her, a heat she had come to recognize as her only anchor. Caleb stepped up, his large hand coming to rest on the small of her back. Through the thin silk of her dress, his touch felt like a brand, a silent promise in the dark. "You're shaking, Ello," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against the wind. He turned her to face him, his thumbs tracing the dark circles under her eyes. "This isn't just the press, is it? What's eating at you?" Quote, "It feels too real, Caleb," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The dress, the rings, the way my mother actually smiled at you tonight. I'm terrified that when the 6 months are up, I'll wake up and realize I've traded my grandfather's cage for a heart that's been shattered into 50 million pieces." Caleb pulled her into his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, protective strength. He tucked her head under his chin, his heartbeat steady against her ear. "I'm not a contract, Eowyn. I'm a man. And this thing between us, isn't a line item on a balance sheet. I'm not going anywhere." The moment was shattered by a sharp, mocking clap. Tyler, Eowyn's ex-boyfriend and the man who had spent years trying to sink his claws into the Vance fortune, stepped out from the shadows of the garden. He looked at them with a predatory smirk, a tablet glowing in his hand. "How touching," Tyler sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "The cowboy and the queen. It's a shame your epic love story has such a high price tag." "I've been doing some digging, Caleb. I know about the $2 million wire transfer scheduled for the day after the divorce clause kicks in." Eowyn felt the blood drain from her face. She stepped back, her hand dropping from Caleb's arm. "Tyler, leave, now." "Oh, I'll leave," Tyler laughed, stepping closer until he was inches from Caleb's face. "But first, I want to see if the hero knows the truth. Did she tell you, Caleb? If she divorces you within 5 years, she loses the inheritance anyway. You aren't just her husband. You're her golden handcuffs. She didn't marry you for love. She married you because she needed a body in a suit to satisfy a dead man's whim. How does it feel to be bought and paid for?" Quote, Caleb didn't flinch. He looked at Tyler with a calm, terrifying coldness that made the air turn to ice. "It feels like you're a man who doesn't understand what it's like to be chosen." "I don't care about the money, Tyler, and I certainly don't care about your opinion of my wife." "Wife?" Tyler spat. "She's a transaction, and I have the recording of her telling her lawyer exactly how much she was willing to pay to keep you quiet." Tyler disappeared back into the party, leaving a deafening silence behind. Eowyn couldn't look at Caleb. The weight of the lie, the contract, and the money felt like a mountain between them. "Is it true?" Caleb asked, his voice low and hollow. The 5-year clause? Quote, I was going to tell you, Elowen gasped, tears finally spilling over. But I was afraid you'd leave. I was afraid that if you knew how long the lie had to last, you'd realize I wasn't worth the prison. Caleb looked out at the black ocean, his jaw tight. The longing that had fueled them for weeks was suddenly eclipsed by a raw, jagged pain. You didn't think I was worth the truth, Elowen. That's what hurts. Not the time, not the money, just the fact that you still think I can be bought. He walked away, leaving her alone in the wind. The fake wedding was 12 hours away, and for the first time, the $50 million felt like the poorest thing in the world. The morning of the wedding didn't bring peace. It brought a cold, suffocating clarity. City Hall was a fortress of limestone and flashbulbs, swarmed by a press corps that smelled blood in the water. Elowen stood in the dressing room, her reflection a ghost in cream-colored silk. Her hands, usually so steady when managing millions, shook so violently she could barely hook her pearls. Every diamond on her neck felt like a shard of ice, a reminder of the wealth that had become her cage. He's here, Madison whispered, slipping into the room. Her usual Texas vibrance was dimmed by a solemn concern. But Elowen, he looks like a man walking to his own execution. You two need to talk, or this vow is going to be the biggest lie New York has ever seen. I can't, Elowen choked out, a sob catching in her throat. If I look at him, I'll tell him to run. I'll tell him to take the $2 million and go back to Texas. Back to a life where things are simple and honest. I've poisoned him with my legacy. Maddie, I've turned a good man into a co-conspirator. The march to the rotunda was a blur of clicking shutters and hushed whispers. As Elowen reached the top of the marble stairs, she saw him. Caleb was standing by the officiant, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He looked magnificent, and entirely unreachable. When their eyes met, Elowen felt a physical blow to her chest. There was no anger in his gaze, only a profound, weary sadness that hurt worse than any shout. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice droning on about the sanctity of marriage, blissfully unaware that he was presiding over a crime scene. Just as he reached the exchange of rings, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open with a violent crash. Stop this charade, Tyler shouted, his voice echoing off the high-domed ceiling. He strode down the aisle, holding his tablet aloft like a weapon. I have the full recording. I have the financial ledgers. This isn't a marriage. It's a wire fraud scheme designed to trick the Vance executors out of $50 million. Quote, the room erupted. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust like spears. Elowen felt the world tilting, the familiar coldness of the Vance legacy finally swallowing her whole. She looked at the floor, waiting for the end. Then, a hand, large, warm, and calloused, found hers. Caleb stepped in front of her, his massive frame shielding her from the predatory lenses. You're right, Tyler, Caleb's voice boomed, silenced the room with its raw, Texan authority. It did start as a contract. It started as a mistake by a woman who was being hunted by vultures like you. She was desperate to save her grandfather's dream, and I was a man who didn't know the difference between a business deal and a destiny. He turned, not to the cameras, but to Elowen. He took both of her trembling hands in his, forcing her to look up, to see the stormy gray of his eyes, now burning with an incandescent honesty. But here's the truth that isn't on your recording, Tyler, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a tender, intimate register that made the rest of the world vanish. I don't want the $2 million. I don't want the expansion funds. And I sure as hell don't want to be a golden handcuff. Elowen, I've spent every night for the last month falling in love with the woman behind the wall. I've spent every hour longing for the version of you that doesn't care about the Vance name. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the contract, the original one from the Obsidian. With a slow, deliberate motion, he ripped it in half, then into quarters, letting the confetti of their life fall to the marble floor. I'm walking out that door, Caleb said, his heart laid bare in his eyes. I'm going to a diner down the street to have a real breakfast, no cameras. No executors. No millions. If you want to be the billionaire queen, stay here and finish the ceremony. But if you want to be my wife, walk out with me. We'll leave the money for the vultures. Elowyn looked at the inheritance executors, who sat frozen in the front row. She looked at her parents, whose faces were masks of horror at the thought of losing the fortune. Then, she looked at Caleb, the man who had accidentally saved her soul. Take it, Elowyn whispered, turning to the executors. Her voice grew stronger, ringing with a freedom she hadn't felt in 30 years. Take every cent. Give it to the trust. I'm done being a prisoner. She turned back to Caleb, a radiant, tearful smile breaking across her face. I hope you're hungry, cowboy, because I'm not staying here another second. They walked down the aisle, hand in hand, stepping over the shredded remains of their contract. The press followed them to the steps. But Elowyn didn't see the flashes. She only saw the man beside her. As they reached the sidewalk, the bells of a nearby church began to chime. It was her 30th birthday. She had lost $50 million. But as Caleb pulled her into a deep, soul-shattering kiss in the middle of the New York traffic, she knew she had finally inherited everything that mattered. The contract was dead. Their life had just begun.